to travel to other worlds. Until recently, this seemed to be an impossibility. But great new discoveries have brought us to the threshold of a new frontier, the frontier of interplanetary space.
Welcome everybody to a new episode of the Planet Ping Pong podcast. I'm your host Andy, and this is the podcast where we cover everything related to table tennis. So that's news, reviews, discussions, all that kind of stuff, and we're probably going to get distracted somewhere along the line. But before we get started with this episode, I actually just want to make a quick little announcement, and that is now, the podcast is now available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, I believe, and a few other kind of sources where you can get your podcasts to listen to. And so now you don't need to just stick to the YouTube page. Now you can actually go and download it on your phone directly if you have Apple Music or Spotify or whatever. So you can listen to this podcast and future episodes of the podcast really anytime that you want to. It's a pretty cool thing, and I'm glad that I actually got that thing working. I'm not the most tech savvy person, but I was able to get it done. So yeah, the Planet Ping Pong podcast is now on Apple Music, Spotify, um, Deezer, and a few other podcasts kind of places where you can listen to them. I'm gonna try to get them onto Google Podcasts and some other websites, but that might have to wait a little bit. But without further ado, let's get started with this week's news. Okay, and for this week, again, the news is going to be pretty slow. Of course, because of the coronavirus pandemic, there isn't really a whole lot of news to kind of take in, and that's not unique to table tennis. Every single sport is going through this at the moment where news is just so slow because in the world of sports, you can't really do a whole lot right now. I know some MMA and boxing organizations are starting to open up again without public during their big events. But aside from that, soccer hasn't really started, baseball hasn't started either. Football, that kind of stuff. Nothing has really started to reopen at a big scale, and table tennis is no exception. But what there is that Xiom, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, has just announced that they are releasing a new blade in the 1st of June. For anybody who doesn't kind of understand, so when we're getting a racket, a custom racket for table tennis, we always have to buy the pieces kind of separately. And so the wooden piece in the middle, that's called the blade, and then you would attach the rubbers on separately. And you'll find that it's actually really flexible. You can kind of change it and tailor it to whatever your playstyle is. You can have a harder blade so that the ball can travel faster, or you can have a softer blade or a softer rubber so that the ball will actually travel slower, which is really good for some defensive player. We're going to be talking about everything related to table tennis playing styles and all that kind of jazz as the main segment of this week's show. But I just kind of wanted to get through this new blade that Xiam announced. This is called the 36.5 ALX blade. Really interesting name, and it's actually really interesting when you start getting into the meat of the blade itself, because you'll find that it uses ALX carbon. For those, again, who aren't too aware, because this is the Everyman's Table Tennis podcast, when we make a table tennis blade or when we have one, usually the way it works is that it'll be about 4, 5, sometimes 6 plies of wood. And for a lot of really strong offensive blades, there'll often be about 2 layers of carbon in between those wooden plies. The reason is that it makes the blade a little bit harder and it makes the ball explode off the racket a lot faster. So it's basically a method to make the ball explode and go travel faster than you would with an all wooden blade. All wooden blades are really good for people who are just kind of starting out, who need a lot of control in their game, and maybe for some defensive players who want the ball to be traveling kind of slowly. But for a lot of offensive players, you're going to want to have some carbon in the middle, somewhere in between those plies of wood so that the ball travels faster and that gives you a little bit more punch when you actually do a full stroke on the ball. What makes this blade more interesting, however, is that it uses ALX carbon, which I don't believe has really been used in any other blade, if I'm correct. It might have been used in one blade by Butterfly, but I can't remember anything off the top of my head that uses ALX. Most blades from the more high end kind of tier of table tennis blades would include something like ALC carbon, ZLC carbon. I know there's a new blade by Butterfly that uses Kevlar, which is also really unique, but this is using ALX carbon. I wonder how it's going to affect the ball, if it's going to be a little bit softer than perhaps other carbons, so it might kind of reduce the speed on that, or if it's going to be harder. I'm not too sure, but I would really like to try it out someday. But another really interesting feature is that this is the first blade that actually uses cold pressing when they're kind of finishing the blade itself. And I really wonder what the purpose of that is, because according to Xeom, it's supposed to kind of strengthen and release the best performance out of the wood of the table tennis racket. But, cold pressing, I haven't really seen that before in any other table tennis blade. Again, I would imagine that it makes the blade a little bit more solid, a little bit harder, so that might give a little bit more punch to the ball itself. But again, we'll have to know because the blade is being released on June 1st. I wish I could pick it up if I'm being honest, but, you know, a lot of like these high-end Xeon blades, butterfly blades, you know, any kind of equipment by Stiga, that all that kind of jazz, that's super expensive. So I don't think I'll be able to pick it up at least right away. Maybe when I'm building a new racket, I might save up a little bit of extra money here and there to get one of the higher end blades, but we'll have to wait and see. And with that, I think that's really all the news that we have for this time. Again, because of the coronavirus pandemic around the whole world, it's going to be pretty slow as far as news goes for another while. Hopefully, in the summer, it's going to start picking up again. And I know in September, we're set to have a few tournaments over in Korea. And I believe there's set to be another tournament in China sometime in October. Though I'm not too sure about that one. But with that being said, now that we finished the news, how about we go on to the main topic of the week? Today, what I wanted to talk about is just kind of some really interesting styles from different professional players in the world of table tennis. Some really interesting, some really offensive, maybe some more defensive styles as well. But the world of table tennis is extremely diverse, and so that's kind of what I wanted to talk about a little bit today. And so, how about we get started with that? So, in the world of table tennis, especially in the international and kind of the higher tier circuits, you're going to see quite a lot of different styles. Some are really offensive, like you'll see with the guys in the top three, top five, but there are also some really defensive styles as well. I kind of want to touch on each individually, and so I kind of want to get started with some prominent offensive players. Of course, anybody in the top five, top 10 really is like an extremely offensive player, especially in the top 10 of the male circuit. And so, of course, we have guys like Fan Jindong, who has like a really explosive kind of offensive style. We have guys like Timo Boll, who are very flashy with their playing style. Timo Boll does a really cool thing in his matches. This is kind of rare that he does it. But of course, you can only hold a racket with one hand usually because the handle itself is really kind of small. But sometimes if the ball goes too far over to his backhand side, then he'll actually just change the racket from his right hand to his left hand and he'll hit the ball like that. It looks really flashy, and every time that he gets it, everybody just goes nuts. It's a really cool thing that I think everybody should go watch. There's probably a highlight video of every single time he's done that on YouTube, so I would probably really recommend to go look at that. Because Timo Boll's backhand kind of racket hand switch thing is amazing to watch. It's really incredible because you rarely see stuff like that in the international circuit. You might kind of get away with it if you're just playing in an amateur club or just playing with your friends for fun or something like that. You might get away with changing the racket from your right hand to your left hand or vice versa. but it's so rare that it happens in the international, especially in the top 10. And Timo Boll does that pretty often, and it's insane. Another offensive style from Europe that I want to talk about is with the player Kalinikos Kreanga. Anybody who knows who Kalinikos Kreanga is knows exactly what I'm talking about. So, of course, in table tennis, we have the forehand and the backhand, but for the most part, most players have a stronger forehand than they do with their backhand. The reason is it's just that it's a bit of an easier motion to kind of swing with your forehand side because the backhand side is usually less flexible. You don't have as much wrist movement. You don't have as much space either to actually do a complete and really strong stroke. And so a lot of people will go out of their way to kind of use their footwork to put themselves in a position that they never have to really use the backhand kind of offensively. Kalinikos Kranga is a bit of the opposite of that. Kalinikos Kranga has the easily the best backhand in table tennis history. It's weird because he might even have a stronger backhand than he does a forehand. If you've seen him in his kind of earlier matches, I believe he's still playing, but not maybe as high as he used to. But if you look at his matches from the early 2000s when he was playing against guys like Ma Lin and Timo Boll, I believe, Kalinikos Kreanga was really just ripping through his opponents anytime that he had an opportunity to hit the ball with his backhand. The reason why, I guess, is that he actually goes very deep on the backhand. And so when we're starting usually with the backhand stroke in table tennis, you kind of want to have the racket somewhere around the middle section of your body and then kind of shoot it upwards to like a height that's about your mouth, basically. But what he does is that he puts his racket all the way down to like his hip. It's so low, but because his racket is so low, when he whips it out, there's so much speed and there's so much power that it's so difficult to control. And you can see that because in his matches, even though he's playing against these guys that were ranked like number 3, number 2, number 4, as soon as he started hitting the backhand, you can see the other player just lose complete control and they just have no idea how to react. Some other players have been known for their backhand as well, but I don't think anybody has kind of reached the level of fame that Kalinikos Krianga has because of his backhand. He's such an interesting case because whereas most people just have a pretty decent backhand, his backhand is almost at the center of his game, which is really rare for both the men's and women's circuits. And so I would love to see someone who has a pretty similar backhand to him kind of rise up to the top 10 again. Because watching him play, it looks really interesting because he'll just be playing normally, but the moment that ball starts getting to Krianga's backhand and he just starts whipping it, then it's like out of nowhere, the person on the other side of the table, it looks like they just got punched in the face or something because they're lost. They have no idea what to do after Krianga starts hitting those backhands. Now, we talked a lot about the backhand and some players that are a bit prominent with that, but I kind of want to talk about the forehand now. So, of course, the forehand is probably the easiest stroke or the easiest set of strokes in table tennis. And so it's a bit difficult to say who is the best at it because really everybody should be really good at it. It's not a skill like the backhand that has a lot of flexibility in terms of how good people are with it. The forehand is really kind of the essential technique that everybody should be an expert at least the guys who are at like the top 10. With that being said, if I were to talk about players who I think might have the best backhands, or sorry, forehands in the game, I would have to mention two players at least right from the top. One being Ma Long, who is considered to be one of the best players of all time. I don't believe he's ranked number 1 anymore. I want to say he's maybe number 3 because Fan Zhendong is now currently ranked number 1 in the world. But I think Ma Long was at number 1 before Fan Zhendong took the spot from him. But he is also known for having a really strong forehand, but he's also just one of the most well-rounded players in the game at the moment as well. He has such a good understanding of the sport and all the dynamics that go with it. And so whether it's his footwork, his backhand, his forehand, his loops, his blocks, his kind of all his techniques, everything that's in the game, his strategies as well, it doesn't really matter. It's always going to be one of the best in the game because that's how good he is. He's so good at everything that regardless of what aspect you're looking at, Ma Long fits along that category of one of the best in whatever kind of technique that we're talking about. Another player from China that I want to talk about is Xu Xin. Xu Xin is known as the Cloud Walker because he mixes his forehand and his footwork in a way where he'll just jump across the table so that he just doesn't have to use the backhand. It's hilarious to look at, but it's also mesmerizing to look at because his forehand is so swift and so smooth, and there's so much power in there. And it brings me to another topic that's kind of connected to this, and that's the Penhold style. The Penhold style, for those who don't know, is one of the two dominant styles that we have in table tennis to hold your racket. Basically, we have the shake hand style, which is basically the most common type of grip, and that's just holding it as you would be shaking somebody's hand. And so it's kind of like you're holding a, I don't know, like a baseball bat. Like you really kind of tightly grip the handle of it. And then there's the penhold style, which, as kind of the name implies, you would hold the racket as you would a pen. And so the actual surface of the racket is kind of pointing downwards. But the style really helps develop that aggressive offense that a lot of players need because it it helps the racket kind of become an extension of the arm. And so what happens is that you people who play in the penhold style often have an amazing and a super strong forehand, but the backhand side tends to lack quite a lot with most penhold players. Now there are some penhold players who are known for having some really good backhands, like Wang Hao, for example. He's kind of one of the first players to kind of innovate and kind of elevate the level of play with Penhold because along with some other Penhold players kind of invented this new type of backhand for Penhold players that wasn't really common before. It's a lot of technicalities and we'll get to that another time probably, but basically before maybe the 2005-ish period, before then, the backhand was really the big weakness of the Penhold style because you wouldn't really have a strong enough backhand, and so people who were playing the shakehand style, which is much more well-rounded, would just shoot towards the backhand and they would consistently get points. However, nowadays, the backhand is starting to get better with Penhold players, especially with guys like Shushin, but it still remains a bit of a weakness of the Penhold style. But with Shushin's footwork, he can almost ignore the backhand side mostly because he just uses his footwork to place himself in a position where he can just shoot these super strong forehands. And he's not the only one that kind of has this play style. In the early 2000s, we had a player from Korea called Ryu Sung Min, who is now one of the big cheese kind of leaders of the table tennis kind of organizations around the world. But he was playing a slightly different style of penhold, where the backhand side on that is usually even weaker, and he would just kind of do the same thing where he would use his footwork to put himself in a position where he could just shoot these missiles from the forehand. Now, I guess when we're talking about table tennis styles, there's also one thing that I want to mention, and that is that for whatever reason, I don't know why, and I don't think a whole lot of people know why either, is that when we look at men and women when they play, there's a big difference there. It's not related to strength or anything like that. It's just an actual tactical kind of strategy that changes. What happens a lot when you see men play is that you'll see a lot of these big strokes with the forehand and the backside. And so what happens a lot is that there are these really long rallies and the ball travels a huge distance in between the players. But when we look at women play, for whatever reason, we see a lot more of a short punch style of play. Like what I mean by that is that rather than staying far from the table and doing these large strokes like we see with the top 10 men play, what happens a lot with the top 10 women is that they'll stay really close to the table and they'll do these really kind of fast jabs at the ball so that they can just shoot the ball in a lot of different directions really quickly. And so what happens is that women play a lot faster than men often, and it looks really cool too because rather than seeing the ball go from one place to another, to another, to another, when we see you women play, it just starts shooting like one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, and it looks really fun to look at. In some cases, I actually enjoy watching women play more than men because it's just so fast. I think players like Mima Ito are the perfect example of this because if you watch them play, they're basically belly up against the table and they're just punching the ball and it goes so fast and it gets returned so fast and it makes these really short but really fun rallies to watch rather than the long and extensive rallies that are kind of suspenseful with the top 10 male players. Again, I'm not too sure why, and I don't think many other people know why, but for whatever reason, there is this difference in between the men and women when we play table tennis in styles. Really interesting, but for the last style that I'll get into, and I want to cover this more on another episode, so I'll just talk about it briefly here, is that I want to talk about the defensive play styles. And so what happens a lot with defensive players is that you'll see them kind of go really far off the table and while they're waiting for the ball to come back to them, they are getting ready to just put a lot of backspin on the ball with this long chopping motion. And what happens is that it creates these really long and really suspenseful rallies because it's the defensive player essentially waiting for the other person to make a mistake and then capitalizing on a mistake. And so I think defensive styles of play take a little bit more of a different approach to the game, and it's a different set of skills that you don't really see with offensive players. I think it's a really interesting style. Players from Korea, I find, are a lot more defensive than some other countries. In Korea, we've had players like Ju Se-hyuk and Seo-won, who are kind of the quintessential defense players. But we have been seeing some more defensive players coming up from countries like Japan and some places in Europe as well. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see where defensive styles go from here. They're always kind of few at the top 10, at the top 20 level. They're not that often ranked at like number 5, but there's always at least a few people in the top 20 who play with the defensive style. So hopefully, I hope that once the table tennis tournaments start kicking up again and start happening again, I hope that we get to see more defensive style come and rise to the top levels of the rankings. And with that, I think it's a good opportunity for us to kind of leave this for next time. And how about we actually get to our letters segment? Actually, we got our first message, first letter by a viewer. And so why don't we go ahead and answer that? Now, the very first question that we have for the show for us to answer comes from Jason, and he sent a voice message, but unfortunately, I couldn't get it on the podcast itself. So I'm just going to have to just say it out loud. But he basically wants me to talk about some other grips of the racket that are not the shake hand or penhold styles. I think it's a really interesting question because there are quite a lot of grips out there. Maybe not as popular, but there are a few. One of them that I want to mention right away is the claw style. And this is kind of similar to the penhold style where you kind of have the racket pointing downwards, except on one side you have your thumb resting on the rubber, and then on the backhand side you have the other four fingers on the rubber. And it looks kind of interesting because you're just kind of clawing the rubber itself. You're not really holding on to the handle that much. But there's really only one player that I can think of off the top of my head who plays with this sometimes. Adam Bobrow, who's like the big cheese commentator of the ITTF, has done a video where he played against a girl from Japan who he called the Claw, and that's kind of where the name originated, where she will play with the shake hand style. But every once in a while, when she gets into some really heated offensive rallies, she'll just switch to this grip claw style. It looks really cool. I would imagine that the backhand suffers quite a bit because you're covering a lot of the rubber with your fingers already. And so I would imagine that the backhand side is not as strong as the forehand. But I can also see it being pretty good for the forehand, kind of a style similar to Shushin, where if you were to move with the ball and kind of position yourself so you hit the ball with the forehand consistently, I can imagine that being a pretty successful style. But another grip that I want to mention, and this kind of comes with a full type of racket itself, and I have no idea what this grip is called, but if I were to explain it, is that you're basically holding the racket like a gun. And it looks really funky because you're basically holding on to it, but the racket itself, the blade, has a different shape so that you're holding on basically a gun handle, and the essentially where the barrel of the gun would be the position of the rubber. I can't really explain it without really showing it, but if you've seen it, you'll see that it looks really weird. It's this weird gun grip, but I don't think that would be a really effective style either because there you're losing a lot of stability with the wrist. The big advantage point with the shake hand and the penhold grip is that you have a lot of control over the wrist and how you move that, and the motions of the wrist are really controlled and smooth. But when you have that gun grip, you don't have nearly as much control over the angle, and the angling is super important when you're kind of responding to the spin that a lot of players are putting on the ball. And so I don't think that grip would be that effective because you're kind of sacrificing that kind of control of the angle with the wrist, but you're not really getting anything in return either because you're not really getting a super strong backhand, but you're also not really getting a super strong forehand. The only thing that you would be getting is a bit more range on both your backhand and forehand side because that has the rubber kind of further away from your hand. And so you do have a bit more range when you're playing with this gun grip, but at the same time, you're kind of gaining that range, but you're removing a lot of the stability and control that you need when you're responding to the spin from other players. Those two are kind of really the only unorthodox grips that I can think of off the top of my head. I can't really think of any others, but if there are some, please let me know. You can follow us on Instagram at galaxytabletennis, or you can put a comment down if you're watching this on YouTube. Or if you want to send in a letter or anything, you can contact me either through my Instagram or you can send in a question at galaxytabletennis@gmail.com. And with that, I guess I'll see you guys next week. Make sure to subscribe if you're on YouTube, subscribe if you're on Apple Podcasts, and stay tuned for next week where we're going to have a bit more of an interesting topic as well. See you!